Welcome everybody to the Unequal Bargaining Power webinar on wage suppression. I'm Larry Michel. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, and I oversee the Unequal Bargaining Power initiative. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Jared Bernstein, let me just say a few words about the Unequal Power initiative. It is a 3-year multidisciplinary effort providing intellectual analysis explaining why unequal bargaining power in the workplace needs to be integrated into the core framework of economics, of economic policy, and all matters affecting workers. The lack of unequal power in the workplace has dramatic and broad-based effects. It creates a lack of freedom in the workplace and beyond, everything from loss of freedom of speech to the inability to protect yourself from injury, illness, and death. It undermines our ability to provide constitutional, statutory, and common law workplace protections. It generates wage and income inequality and wage suppression. It weakens civic engagement and representative democracy, and it hobbles our ability to address workplace race and gender discrimination. So other than all that, it's really great. Now, if you take this seriously, that it has these effects, then we need to center workplace bargaining power in employment law, in economics, in social employment labor policy, in political science, and in philosophy. How does the project do its work? Well, we've commissioned several dozen pieces of research. We release them. We have public events like this. We do public writing. Our goal is to reach the media, elite opinion leaders, policymakers, academics, and activists. We want to change the way people view things so that they center unequal bargaining power. Our view is that the competitive labor market analysis of traditional economics cannot explain really important things like racial disparities, gender disparities, the fact that workers don't get compensating differentials when they are in risky jobs. It cannot explain wage suppression and wage inequality, which is what we're talking about today. The view is that the labor market, that the imperfections in the labor market are the norm. That is, we should not start from a competitive labor market. The point is not to make the labor market more competitive. It is to rebalance power in the labor market. And that's a different take than a traditional neoclassical take of there's imperfections, let's fix the imperfections. We can fix the imperfections. We need to strengthen workers. Our last year of the project, the third year coming up, is focused on assessing the economic claims made in employment law and philosophy, which are used to justify the assumption of equal power. We are going to be releasing a multifaceted critique of the so-called freedom of contract framework, which has been used in policy and in court decisions. Simply, the notion that employers and employees are equals, negotiating optimal terms of wages and working conditions is flawed, and it's not a guide to anything useful. So that's the project. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome Jared Bernstein back to EPI to speak on wage suppression. I want to assure everybody that I did really deep research on Jared's history, despite the fact that we've been very close friends for 30 years. Here's the basic facts. Jared is currently a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. He was in 2009 to 2011, he was the chief economic advisor to Vice President Joseph Biden. After he did that, he was an economist at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. But before he went into the Obama-Biden administration, Jared worked at the Economic Policy Institute from 1992 to 2008, where he co-authored 9 versions of EPI's flagship publication, The State of Working America, and wrote extensively about wages, poverty, and inequality, some of which I was honored to co-author with him. Now, I can't say that Jared is the only State of Working America co-author to ascend to the Council of Economic Advisors, because Heather Boucher was also a co-author. But through my extensive research, I have confirmed that Jared is the most prominent graduate, the most prominent economist to ever graduate from the Manhattan School of Music and to play jazz professionally. What qualifies Jared to be our keynote speaker, however, is his answer in a 2018 interview on the Manhattan School of Music website, where he was asked, "What are you most proud of achieving?" And he didn't mention his two lovely daughters, but he was sticking to the economics. Here's what he said. "I'm proud to have been part of successful campaigns to raise minimum wages in various incarnations. I've helped move a macroeconomic agenda which emphasizes the importance of full employment and very tight labor markets. I've also helped elevate the issue of inequality and the key role played by power and its imbalances in our economy and society." That's quite a good qualification. So Jared, all yours.
Well, thank you so much for that, such a nice introduction. I'm so happy to be here today to talk about this paper by Larry and Josh. The paper represents the culmination of work that EPI has engaged in since its inception in 1986. Work with, as you've heard, I'm proud to have been associated. And in that regard, I faced the challenge today of figuring out what to say beyond, "Yep, they're right. That's what happened. Next question." So I could regale you with war stories, like the time Larry and I were working together in his office when a window washer appeared outside the window through which he saw a paper about blue-collar wage declines. He pointed through the window at the paper and he mouthed, "I want that." And Larry grabbed the paper, jumped up, and disappeared for about a half an hour as he found, and as I imagine he explained the findings to this gentleman. I could play EPI trivia with you. For example, who here, excluding Larry, knows who Sparky was? Sparky. I will say without exaggeration that she's unquestionably one of the reasons we're here today and absolutely integral to the foundation of this invaluable institute. So submit your answers. Who was Sparky? And the winner will get a free copy of the next economic report of the president. How's that? But instead, I'm going to speak to two broad areas. First, I'll review a few parts of the paper, and second, I'll speak about the ways in which many of these ideas intersect with Bidenomics. Before I get into the paper, let me impart something to you that many in this audience will find, I think, kind of uplifting. One way to view the analytical part of the paper that Larry and Josh have presented to us is that it engages in a set of ongoing debates in inequality economics. And for those of us of and beyond a certain age, those debates, though they're often they start within the academy, they're far from academic. Thanks to EPI and other progressive institutions, including the labor movement, along with some stalwart allies in both the policy and political worlds, we are no longer skunks at the neoclassical garden party, but are understood to be on the empirically correct side of the wage and inequality developments on which Larry and Josh report. Now, if you think I'm being too rosy in that assessment, consider that you are listening to someone who used to be invariably outnumbered in the political economy circles I've moved in since the 2000s. I mean, literally 20-1 outnumbered. Now, as I speak to you today from my office at the White House, I'm in top-level meetings with where progressive economic policy ideas are surfaced, and the majority of the folks in the room, people who are not incidentally far younger and more diverse than in any administration I've been part of, roll up their sleeves and think about ways to bring these ideas to fruition. Simply put, when you hear this president give recent speeches touting the bargaining clout associated with full employment, or the need to push back on industry concentration, or the importance of supporting our manufacturers, of onshoring supply chains, working with labor to strengthen collective bargaining, I urge you to recognize that one reason you're hearing that is because A, Joe Biden understands how economies actually work and don't work, and B, his team is right there with him. And I will also say that, as Larry said, Many of the members of that team are touched directly and indirectly by EPI and by Larry himself. This paper is a detailed, fact-driven argument against the, quote, prominent interpretation that disappointing wage growth is an unfortunate result of apolitical market forces that one neither can nor would want to alter. Here again, we have a close alignment with Bidenomics. Any model of the labor market that leaves out bargaining power is not merely fatally flawed in an analytic sense. It's deeply politically flawed, implicitly accepting embedded inequalities with racial and gendered implications. Over my many years in this profession in this town, I have come to recoil at the benign seeming notion of economic equilibrium as it uncritically accepts historical power imbalances under the guise of some immutable mathematical truth. Or to speak more plainly, any alleged equilibrium that accepts Black unemployment rates that are consistently twice that of white rates is obviously no equilibrium at all. In this regard, the paper did a nice job of tying racial and gender wage suppression to the core theme of power dynamics, as well as pointing the way forward, albeit in sometimes antiseptic language. So they write, Josh and Larry write, if the maintenance of racial and gender wage gaps fosters divisions and hamstrings collective cross-race and cross-gender efforts to raise wages in workplaces, then these gaps could be a powerful force for employers looking to keep overall wages suppressed, unquote. In case that isn't clear, it's Larry and Josh calling for worker solidarity across racial and gender lines. Now, let's turn to the part of the paper I call, if you're going to strike the king, you better not miss. And that is their critique of skill-biased technological change. This is the idea that the primary factor driving up wage inequality is evolving information technologies, computer technologies that are boosting employers' skill demands for workers whose skills complement that technology, often translated as college graduates in this literature. Larry and Josh argue, quote, none of the basic indicators of automation's impact and of skill deficits used to establish these narratives have been evident over the last 25 years. Consequently, there's no basis for considering automation-driven skill-biased technological change as a significant factor in wage suppression or the growth of wage inequality since the mid-1990s. Their evidence includes the increase of the college wage premium, the relative wage trend behind the SBTC, skill-biased tech change hypothesis. That trend in that premium slowed quite sharply post-1995 as the 95-50, so as the high-middle wage gap accelerated, suggesting that skill-biased change wasn't the dominant source. Next, they point out how so much of the increase in inequality in recent decades has taken place at the very top of the scale, reflecting the expansions of executive compensation and the finance sector. This has tax implications, by the way, both in terms of tax fairness that the president often invokes, and in terms of the public finance insight that the incidence of taxing excess profits falls on excess profit holders. In the skill-biased tech change stories, more education equals more relative demand and thus higher wages. But as Larry and Josh point out, over the last 3 decades, there have been no increase in the wage gaps between those with some college, those with a high school diploma, and those who left high school. Similarly, the wage gap between the median, the 50th percentile, and low-wage workers has been stable or declining since 1987. 2 further points about skill-biased change. First, one incorrect critique of EPI's work in this space is levied by those who argue that if you challenge the dominance of this skill-biased tech change argument, you don't think educational access or attainment matters. Somehow, if you attack SBTC, you don't care about education. But EPI's contribution there has been equally important. Just because relative to wage suppression policies, educational attainment doesn't explain much of the changes in relative wage trends, it matters to the levels of those wage premiums. Thus, EPI in general, and Larry in particular, often guided by the work of the eminent scholar that many of us know as Jesse's dad, that is Richard Rothstein, have emphasized both access to quality education for those who face access barriers, and just as important and far too overlooked, EPI and Rich have emphasized the impact of societal inequality on children's ability to learn once they get to school, an area, by the way, which the pandemic really pulled the curtain back on. Second, while I would never go as far as to argue that Larry and Josh are kicking through an open door or that they've won this part of the argument, many former SB skill bias tech change adherents, as cited in the paper, recognize the logic of the case that the paper makes. That's not that surprising, as the argument is empirically muscular, and most of these economists are smart, data-driven analysts who are open to opposing views, though sometimes with a lag. Yet another unique attribute of this work is that Larry and Josh have dwelt in this swamp for many decades and thus are well positioned to discuss policy. And the paper's discussion here is so exhaustive that I won't attempt to review it. Instead, I'll reflect on the number of areas that I'm very proud to report where the president's economic agenda acts to revoke and reverse wage suppression policies. So Larry and Josh find that labor market slack, and a finding that is of course very dear to my own heart. They find that labor market slack sorry, I'm just having a computer issue here. Oh, that's weird. Sorry, just give me half a second. Okay, sorry. They find that labor market slack is the single largest explanatory factor suppressing wage growth. So here's President Biden in May. When it comes to the economy, rebuilding rising wages aren't a bug, they're a feature. We want to get to something that economists call full employment. Instead of workers competing with each other for jobs that are scarce, we want employers to compete with each other to attract work. We want the companies to attract work. We want the companies to attract workers. That kind of competition in the market doesn't just give workers more ability to earn a higher wage. It gives them the power to demand to be treated with dignity and respect in the workforce, close quote. Let's pause on that for a moment. The president puts rising workers' wages at the core of his Building Back Better agenda. He explicitly ties wage pressure to full employment and to employers competing for workers. And at least to my aging ears, most resonant of all, he references the power that full employment imparts to workers. Now, on one level, this is all just common sense, but to those of us who fought this battle for decades now, it's an absolutely remarkable passage, one that makes me extremely proud of our president and our team. Another reason for emphasizing the power of full employment comes from a finding in this paper, quote, "This growth in the black-white wage gap could be entirely explained by excessive unemployment over this period, given the differing responses of black and white wages to unemployment. Like Larry and Josh, we view full employment as strongly complementary to our racial equity agenda." In terms of collective bargaining, President Biden has been aptly described as the most pro-labor president since FDR, and one with similar sentiments about why labor power is such an important balancing factor in our economy. As this audience knows, the president has been a vocal supporter of the PRO Act, but perhaps less well known are a set of executive orders designed to promote both collective bargaining and labor standards, the latter including a $15 minimum wage for workers on federal contracts. I'm personally honored to be working closely with Vice President Harris's task force on worker organizing and empowerment, which is solidly up and running. The president has also taken a strong foray into the monopsony problem, and we have strong, innovative personnel in place in key agencies who bring an appreciation of the nexus between employer power in concentrated sectors and the impact of concentration, not just on product price, but on the labor price, along with labor standards. On international trade, just yesterday, the president laid out a much-needed update to our Buy American policies. The U.S. government procures $600 billion a year in goods and services, and the current Buy American rules are a Swiss cheese of waivers and underreported data that fail to provide adequate opportunities for domestic producers to fairly compete. And I should note that most of our competitors have much tighter rules channeling their taxpayer dollars to domestic purchases. But the president's aspirations in the international space go far beyond Buy America to the onshoring of critical supply chains, and especially in the infrastructure and building back better agendas to give American manufacturers the tools and the incentives they need to make a strong play for global market share in areas of future demand, especially regarding decarbonization. One way I think about this is that no country has claimed a dominant market share in battery production for energy storage, and we in the Biden administration think that country should be ours. So I've already gone on for a bit long, and I'm just scratching the surface of the intersection between the sweeping findings in this very important paper and our administration's economic agenda. So let me close by stressing that this intersection is endogenous. It stems in part from the fact the Economic Policy Institute has tirelessly and relentlessly fought for economic justice through the application of muscular empirical analysis applied with a healthy dose of common sense, common decency, and racial and gender equity. In so doing, EPI has seeded the economic policy world with not just powerful ideas, but with a substantial and growing group of eyes wide open economists and policymakers, among whom, at least on a good day, I like to count myself. Thank you.
Wow. Well, Jared, that's insightful and correct. and you're definitely, I'm proud to call you my best friend and to have written so much with you and to see the impact you're having on the world. It's a great joy to be, and it's a benefit to the working class. So thank you very much. Well, let me now turn to introducing Naomi Walker, who is going to moderate the panel discussion that is upcoming. I have worked with Naomi for many years prior to her coming to EPI, and I'm very pleased that she's now one of the senior leaders of the Economic Policy Institute. Naomi joined EPI in 2018 as the director of the Economic Analysis and Research Network, EARN, a national network of more than 60 state-level policy research and policy organizations coordinated by EPI. Prior to joining EPI, Naomi worked on state and local policy and politics with both AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and the AFL-CIO. And she also served as a top policy advisor in the Department of Labor under President Obama. And with that, it's all yours, Naomi.
Great. Thanks so much, Larry. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with you all. As Larry mentioned, I'm the director of EARN, and the talented EARN team and EPI economists support the work of those almost 60 state groups around the country as they fight for worker justice and racial justice and gender justice. And if you're interested in learning more about EARN, and if you want to see a list of EARN groups and see if there is one in your state, please go to earn.us. So today we have assembled a talented and brilliant lineup of economists to talk about what wage suppression is, what's caused it, and how we can fight back against it. And joining us today, you've just heard from Larry Michel, who is the former president of the Economic Policy Institute. We'll also hear from Josh Bivens, who's research director at EPI, Suresh Naidu, who's at Columbia University, where he's a professor in economics and international and public affairs, focusing a lot of work on the political economy as well. And Anna Stansberry, who's at MIT, where she's an assistant professor of work and organization studies. And all four of our speakers have written extensively on inequality and power and institutions in the labor market. And I'm really excited to hear what they're going to share with us today. So during our discussion, I'm going to pose a range of questions to our speakers. I want to encourage them to interact with each other, and I want to get you in on the questioning too. So as you're listening, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. and we're going to work really hard to get to them at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. And Jared has gone through some of these things, but why don't we sort of take a step back, and Larry and Josh, if you could talk a little bit about the paper. What is wage suppression, and what does the research that you completed really try to explain?
Well, thanks, Naomi. Let me take the first part. We very consciously refer to what we're explaining as wage suppression rather than wage stagnation. And even though we did use that term for several decades. But the point is to emphasize the fact that this is not something that just happened. It is something where there were conscious decisions made to make it happen, and decisions made by people who have a lot of power that run businesses in corporate America and their political and policy allies, some Democrat, some Republican. So we define wage suppression as the gap between the compensation that a typical worker earned and grew from 1979 to 2017, where the median hourly compensation grew around 13%. But productivity, net productivity for the nerds, net of depreciation, using productivity deflated by the CPI, not the IPD, but conservatively measured, net productivity rose about 56%. So that's a 43 percentage point gap between what the typical worker got and what net productivity grew. We use that as a benchmark to say that's a measure of the amount of wage suppression. If you looked in the 3 decades prior to where we start, those would have grown in tandem, okay? Now, what causes this gap is what we really focus on, and it's really 3 different types of inequality that we think any theory or evidence regarding wage suppression needs to address. The first is the erosion of labor's share of income, which primarily happened in the post-2000 period. The other has to do with the increased inequality within wages and benefits earned by all workers. And there's 2 components of that. One is that people in the bottom 90% lost out to the top 10%, especially the top 1% and the top 0.1%. That's a really big thing that tends to get left out in conventional economics. The second is that there's a persistent growing gap between a worker in the middle and these high wage workers. So those two parts of wage inequality need to be explained. And we should also be cognizant that, as Jared mentioned, the wage gap between the middle wage worker and a low wage worker really hasn't grown for more than 30 years. So we really have, in a sense, the bottom 90 losing to the top 10%. And that's what we try to explain. And I'll let Josh tell you, hey, Josh, what did we find?
So quickly, we examined a range of sort of specific policies that we think were likely candidates for driving this wage suppression. And these were a range of policy shifts done with pretty good knowledge beforehand that they were likely to weigh on wage growth, particularly for the bottom 80%. And so really specifically, we examined the wage impact of like tolerating or even engineering excess unemployment, both failing to end recessions quickly enough and spur recovery quickly enough, but also cutting recovery short, failing to keep the playing field level between workers who want union representation and employers looking to thwart unionization, which led to eroded collective bargaining, globalization managed on capital's terms, efforts to weaken labor standards, including a declining real value of the federal minimum wage, eroded overtime protections, misclassification, a failure to block the introduction of employer-imposed contract terms that create monopsony power. So the widespread introduction of non-competes, individualized arbitration, the waiving the workers' rights to engage in class action suits. And a failure to regulate shifts in corporate structures that empower employers, whether it's domestic outsourcing and franchising, deregulation, or just failure to push back on increases in market concentration. Over the past 40 years, our findings are that the excess unemployment that was tolerated over this time lowered the median wage by about 10 percentage points, eroded collective bargaining by about 8, The effect of globalization by about 6. These 3 factors alone can account for 55% of that gap between productivity and pay that Larry identified as wage suppression. When you add up other factors, such as the influence of non-competes, misclassification, fissuring, the influence of dominant buyers, we think we can sort of map specific policies onto about 3/4 of that gap between productivity and wage growth. We're happy to engage in further discussions about what we got exactly right and exactly wrong about the effect of each of those specific policies. But all in all, we just think there's substantial evidence that policy choices can get you a really long way in explaining that gap between productivity and pay that emerged since 1979. And in the end, in sort of really easy to understand terms, we basically think that the typical worker today would be making about $10 more per hour because of the influence of all of these policy choices that engineered wage suppression. And I think that would just be a game-changing amount for tens of millions of workers.
Let me just add that I'm glad you mentioned that number, that we identified that the median hourly compensation in 2017 was $22. It would have been $32 had these policies not been implemented.
That's a huge amount and would make a ton of difference for most workers. It's pretty astonishing. I want to direct this next question to Suresh. We hear a lot now, and Jared talked some about it, about monopsony and monopoly. And when I was taking Econ 101, those terms weren't really front and center. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the difference in non-economist terms and tell us what really is the role that monopsony plays in worker power.
Yeah, thanks. So I think my job here is to sort of explain this somewhat new literature. It's actually a very old idea. It goes back to like Joan Robinson in 1930s, who's very famous also for lots of contributions to economics in the 20th century. So in a word, I sort of view monopsony as the answer to the question of like, oh, if your employer cuts your wage, what's your probability of staying? And if you ask most people, and you can actually run these surveys and ask them, okay, if your employer cut your wage by 10%, how easy would it be for you to find another job? And now I think we're getting like a range of estimates of this number from a variety of empirical designs, where it's sort of that number is somewhere between, like, let's say 2 and 5. It could be probably 3, it could be 4, it might be 6, but we're in that range. And what that sort of implies is that if employers are using all of that monopsony power that they have, what they would set wages at is kind of roughly something between, let's say, 10 and 20% of a worker's like marginal product. And so there's this gap then that you have a real room for policy to move, is kind of closing that gap between kind of what a worker is adding to sales revenue of a company and what they take home in wages. And so it kind of opens up a space. My view is that this literature kind of opens up a space for bargaining power and institutions in the way that the EPI paper talks about to matter. And so, you can account for like declining minimum wages. The union premium is somewhere between 10 and 20%. And so there's kind of a wedge now for policy to operate on, that you can like raise wages without in fact increasing employment. But it's also, I think, an important lever into the other part of the unequal bargaining power project, which is just kind of this notion of freedom at work, which is, it's kind of how easy is it for you to walk away from your boss? Which is just kind of this very core idea of like, take this job and shove it, which you can hear the Biden administration kind of like it's in the background. Like when the labor market is running hot, when employers are kind of just there's help wanted signs everywhere, workers are kind of like, nah, if you treat me badly, I'm going to walk. And so that really creates like a space for people to exercise autonomy on the job, and to, a lot of the things that employers might get away with when labor markets are slack, they can't get away with when labor markets are tight, exactly because this threat of quitting is that much more binding. And so it's sort of like, I think both on the side of like the wage gap kind of issues and how policy can address the wage gap. It kind of creates some space for that. But then it's also, I think, an opening to talk about like kind of broader issues of autonomy and freedom at work.
Great, thank you. That was a great explanation. Next question, I'm going to kick it to Anna. You have done some really path-breaking empirical work that was published last year by the Brookings Institution, which identified worker power, the erosion of worker power, as the most important factor driving inequality. So can you talk a little bit more about what you found and what kind of response your research has received?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me here today. So the research that I did with Larry Summers was focused on trying to explain what we saw as three of the most important macroeconomic changes in the US economy over the last few decades. And one of those was the rise in inequality, and we focused specifically on the decline in the labor share of income. One of those was the rise in corporate valuations, equity valuations, corporate profitability. And one of those was the decline on average in the rate of unemployment. And this was going, unfortunately, until before the pandemic, where we obviously saw the rate of unemployment spike up again. And most relevant to this audience, of course, is that first factor, which is the decline in the labor share of income, the rise of income inequality. We were trying to ask, to what extent does this broad-based decline in worker power that we've seen in the US for the last few decades explain this? And we tried to quantify in a different exercise, but actually I'll talk in a second about how complementary it is to Larry and Josh's exercise, how much that decline in worker power likely impacted workers in terms of reducing the degree to which workers could share in the profits produced by their firm, in that range that Suresh was talking about, created by the difference between the product of the firm and then the wage that the worker is taking home. How much could worker power enable workers to share in that, and how much has it declined over time? So we looked at the decline in unionization, which has obviously been huge. 1 in 4 workers in the private sector were unionized in the beginning of the 1980s, 6% are today. We looked at other factors that may have increased worker power in formerly high wage industries like manufacturing, like construction, like transportation, where that worker power appears to have declined, and similarly in large firms. So workers in larger firms used to earn more than workers in small firms, observably equivalent ones, and that premium has declined a lot. And factors that could have led to this for non-union workers can include many of the things that we heard Larry and Josh talk about. We think particularly about the change in the set of norms and ideas around shareholder value maximization and the incentives that created to cut labor costs through these changes in corporate structures, through changes in pay, through outsourcing of workers, through undermining of labor standards. And the big picture conclusion from that exercise was that the decline in worker power in the US, we started in the 1980s, can explain the entirety of the decline in the labor share of income over that period. If you map that quantitative estimate to the rise in income inequality for the top 1%, so the rise in the share of income accruing to the top 1%, our estimate suggests it could explain about half of that increase. This is a macroeconomically important phenomenon. Once again, you can query exactly how we quantify it, but the big picture is that as macroeconomists think about changes in the economy over recent decades, including inequality, worker power seems like it has to be a big part of the story. And the thing I wanted to mention regarding the similarity to Larry and Josh's work is we actually did some work. We used different methodologies, different data sets to some extent. We did some work trying to compare our estimates specifically of the effect of the decline in unions on the wage of typical workers. And we found surprisingly similar estimates. And in some sense, the exercise of research is different people coming together with different methods, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, and putting pieces in this jigsaw puzzle that we can understand the world. So to find with different methods and different researchers very similar answers, I think can give us even more confidence that this story is quantitatively important.
And what would you say has been the response that your research has been getting?
Oh, sorry, you asked that and I forgot to answer it.
That's okay.
So we were motivated to write this paper in large part because we were following the debate in macroeconomics on these big macro trends and what had caused them, and thought that there was a bit of a lacuna in that debate around worker power that we thought was a plausible explanation for these trends. And I think obviously EPI has been ahead of the curve on that issue, and many other scholars have too. So definitely not saying this was an impact of our research, but I do think over the last couple of years, we're seeing that issue being centered more in the economics debate. And certainly the reception our research had was one of interest, even if, that is a plausible factor that should be thought about more.
Great, thank you. And then, does anybody else want to chime in on this particular point before we move on to the next question? No? Okay, moving on.
I'll say one thing. I mean, the economics profession, well, there's different parts of the economics profession. There's the center left, and there's a very conservative wing. The very conservative wing has no truck with dealing with worker power. They never have, they never will. The center left has moved somewhat to consider it, but in my mind, they have not really made it central or core. And I think they still operate in one of the things I critiqued at the beginning, which is they think that you should just make the labor market more competitive rather than work to rebuild a balanced power. And this is a point that Suresh has written about, Josh has emphasized. You could have employer power be relatively constant for 4 decades, but if the ability of workers to represent themselves through wages, through unions, to have higher labor standards, minimum wages, what we believe, and another argument is that what's happened is an erosion of worker power more than an increase in employer power. So those are just a contribution, but I think we're seeing progress, but I think we have a ways to go. And anybody who wants to observe, the very conventional NBER labor studies group and their conferences, you will see that it's just a very hesitatingly the progress. And I'm not asking anyone else to comment on that. I'll just say.
So I'll sort of just chime in and say, I think just having sort of watched a bunch of the labor studies, there's a lot of work that's basically in the orbit of monopsony and kind of taking it as a serious thing. And I think I would say probably it's, everyone's yes, obviously there's some scope for monopsony, and that's probably in that 10 to 20% range. But I still think it's that the big movements are going to be the skills and technology, and that and so yeah, you probably do have some room for redistribution on the gap between marginal product and wage, but the big action is probably still going to come from automation, trade, school, the education system. Everyone will always say, well, isn't there a problem with the education system? And so I think the idea is that yes, this is there, but it's not the big picture. That would be my summary of the consensus.
And you're saying that that's an incorrect, that's consensus is kind of flawed, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly flawed, but it's also that, and I think, Larry, we've discussed this before, it's that we should think about power broadly as opposed to just the power inside the market. There's power over policy. And one of the things that I think is under, maybe the paper's long enough, so it's just what is the political coalition and the change in the policy environment that let these policy changes happen. And they happen along with other policy changes that the tuition rate for higher public ed jumps in 1980. It's there's a real sort of contributor to the skills slowdown that's also a policy story. And it's coming along with austerity and these things. And then there's ways in which technology is chosen by employers and developed by the government in a way that can weaken or enhance worker power. And we should take those levers that are also policy levers. And so I take the point that there's policy.
I'm okay with that. Yeah, that's fine.
And I think the point is that there's power inside the labor market, yes, but there's also power in the polity writ large, and that's really important also.
They're not writing papers about that stuff, Suresh. That's all I'll say.
I do want to dig in towards the end of our conversation a little bit more on these policy pieces and policy choices and what can be done to push back on wage suppression. And it's a question that I'm seeing coming up quite a bit in the Q&A section as well. But before we get to that, and we're going to loop back on the automation and skills deficit question too, because it's a thing that I see a lot at the state level. So I'm interested in probing more on that. But before we go there, I want to ask Anna and Suresh to talk a little bit about what the intersection is between racial and gender equity and worker power, and how does this analysis of the erosion of worker power help us understand what's happened with race and gender inequalities?
Shall I hop in on that one first, Suresh? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a hugely important intersection. And I think the most helpful way to think about it is to think about it in two different buckets. So one bucket is sort of, if we're thinking about something like unions as one manifestation of worker power, but not the only one, you know, within unionized workers, is there a smaller racial wage gap or gender wage gap than if workers were not unionized? And the answer to that across almost all dimensions of labor market inequality that you can think of is yes. The racial wage gap between white and African American workers is smaller when they're unionized. The gap between white and Hispanic workers is smaller. The gap between men and women is smaller. And this is because of the many reasons we know that unions and other sort of formal structures of worker power tend to shrink the scope for individual discrimination in pay, but also individual pay setting and bargaining. The other question is, who was unionized and who had and who lost power? And that's a little bit more nuanced. So African-American workers were highly and still are highly disproportionately unionized relative to white workers. So the decline in unionization in the last 40 years was a real blow, particularly to African-American workers, in the sense that decline hit them much harder than a typical white worker, particularly for women. And so the racial wage gap has been expanded, not only because unions close the wage gap within unionized workers, but also because African Americans disproportionately suffered from that decline in unionization over time. On the other hand, for women, in the private sector, in the past, men were disproportionately unionized relative to women. You're thinking about these typical union sectors of the past: manufacturing, mining, construction, transportation. And so men were the ones that were typically hit much more than women by the decline in unionization and the loss of worker power there. And so you get this paradoxical result in some sense where the decline in unionization probably shrank the gender wage gap, but not in a good way, not because women did better, just because men did worse, particularly men without a high school education. And so I think that's one of the interesting instances where you've got to dig into those headline results and say, okay, well, this part of this decline in the gender wage gap is something that's not coming out of a good outcome for workers on aggregate. The other thing I would just mention, of course, is you can't talk about the labor movement's history on race and gender without acknowledging that in the past, that it's not always been an inclusive movement like it is today. In the past, we've seen lots of exclusion explicitly based on race, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. And so that force of worker power as a force for inclusion and intersectional progress is a more recent one that's exciting, and that is great to see continue. Actually, I have one more thing to say, and then I'll let Suresh speak. The other aspect of worker power I think is really important on the race dimension is tight labor markets. And Larry and Josh talk about this a lot in their paper. I think Jared referred to it in his speech as well, which is slack labor markets disproportionately feature very high unemployment for African-American workers. And so tight labor markets empower all workers, but empower racial and ethnic minority workers in particular, and empower workers with less education in a formal sense in particular. And so in that sense, they're a great tool for closing inequality along those dimensions, as well as empowering workers more generally.
Yeah, I sort of like, I think in my thing for EPI, I think it's like, you know, once you take this like voluntary quits kind of measure of tightness very, very seriously, you can kind of imagine a central bank that's saying rates until like an African-American single mom can quit her job voluntarily. and that would be like a tight. That's your like tight labor market, and is when like sort of the marginalized groups are just like empowered enough inside the labor market to like just walk away from a given employer, and that could kind of almost be like a way to sort of think about what tightness means. But I'll also just point out the way that like when you have this view of like that the labor market is sticky, is like it's hard for people to find a job as good as the job that they have. It means that you can actually have room for prejudiced employers to like lower the wages for everyone of that group in the labor market, because what's mattering is that some part of what's driving your wage is your chance of getting a job at another employer. And if the other employers out there, if some of them are not willing to agree to gender parity or are not willing to agree to racial parity, then that's going to lower, even at non-racist employers, it's going to lower the outside option of minority or women workers. And so it gives you a way in which like you can have these idiosyncratic employers driving wage differences kind of throughout the labor market. So discrimination can kind of thrive in some sense when a labor market is monopsonistic like this.
Oh, that's a really
Those are good points. May I add something? I think it's a simple way my simple mind goes to is that let's say the difference between black and white wages is driven in two large chunks. One is for people who are in similar jobs, the black worker will earn less. But it's also that black workers are in worse jobs. They're segregated by industry and occupation. And I think one way to understand the narrative that we tell in our paper is that the loss of power of workers really disproportionately hurt those occupations and industries where Black and Hispanic workers and many women are concentrated. So if you want to fight for racial and gender equity, a big piece of it is reestablishing the power of workers in those jobs to have a good job. And that's labor standards, unions, tight labor markets. So that's one way of thinking about how the intersection of worker power and the position of women and minority workers.
Thank you, Larry. Josh, did you want to get in?
No, I mean, I'd just say super broadly, and we talked about this at the beginning, like the sort of view that your wage is determined by like competitive labor markets and your own personal productivity is always a pretty, it's a pretty pernicious narrative for those who are not earning very good wages in the labor market, and it loads up a lot of blame on the victim. And when you then bring in gaps between racial groups, and you put that lens of what you're going to do, people earn what they're worth in the labor market, that becomes even more pernicious. And so I think bringing in the empirical fact that your wage is not just what you yourself bring to the labor market, your wage is how much power is wielded on your behalf collectively through policy, through history. I think it just leads to a much better place to really understand what's happening with those disparities in the labor market.
Love that point. Thank you.
Can I jump in again briefly, Naomi?
Yeah.
Sorry. Just on Larry's point on the segregation of workers of different races and ethnicities into occupations, I think this is also something super important when we think about the history of labor standards that empower workers and the current situation. So it is well known that in the 1930s, there were carve-outs of entire sectors like agriculture and domestic work from a lot of the labor protections that were enacted. It was no coincidence that most of the people working in those sectors were not white. Today, you can, in some sense, draw parallels with the degree to which certain sectors see their labor standards eroded, whether intentionally or inadvertently, and those sectors that tend to be disproportionately non-white and often disproportionately immigrant. You can see that with domestic workers today even. You can see that to some extent with the degree to which worker misclassification and independent contracting business models are proliferating through jobs like taxi drivers or food delivery drivers. And so I think thinking about how race and gender intersect with sector and occupation and the degree to which we protect those different groups is super important going forward as well, because a standard that seems ostensibly as in so much of the world, right? A standard that seems ostensibly race blind can actually have extremely disparate effects if it's not very carefully looked at.
Thank you for raising that. I want to say at the state level, some of the states like New York are taking a look at some of those workers that were originally carved out of the labor protection, so protections for farm workers and that sort of thing, which is hopeful. Larry, do you want to go back to the skills and automation question, or do you want to move on?
Well, Jared did a great job, and not surprising, Jared and I have done a lot of research together from the early 90s on that question. But it's important to appreciate that, the ongoing progress of automation, it does have an impact on the labor market. Automation has been with us for several hundred years. The question about whether automation has created wage suppression and wage inequality has to be that something different or more happened in recent decades. And I think all the evidence is that it hasn't been that way. And in fact, all of the indicators of automation and its impact on inequality in the labor market have all diminished in the last 25 years. There's just no case. There's no plausible case in my mind that the independent effect of automation has been driving any wage suppression or inequality in the last 25 years. And of course, the automation says nothing about the redistribution upwards to the top 0.1% and the 1%. So the scope for claiming that, it's unfortunate byproduct of positive forces like automation, that should have no standing. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't support education improvement. And I think that it's good to distinguish between fighting inequality and promoting intergenerational mobility. I don't think expanding skills and education is going to do a lot to get the wage productivity gap closed. However, if we do, as the Biden administration says it's trying to, create good quality jobs, right? That's its mantra. Then the question is, who gets those jobs? And so we need to be able to provide to working class and low income students every opportunity to improve their standing to be able to get those jobs. And that includes things that happen within schools. It also means that they need we need early childhood education. We need childcare. We need pre-K. We need things that are going to offset the inequalities that exist, because you can't get opportunity in a sea of inequality.
Thanks, Larry. I am going to kick the next question to Josh. How does increased corporate monopoly power fit into this framework, and how does it contribute to eroded worker power?
So I think our view in the paper is that the trends toward greater product market concentration, they seem recent enough and not yet strong enough to really play a starring role in sort of generating the gap between productivity and pay, which we see, which began growing in the late 1970s. I think some version of concentration of firms might be playing some role here, and particularly recently. But I think the interesting part is that the standard textbook story of how monopoly harms households seems really inoperative here. Like, the standard story is that monopolies in product markets lead to prices being higher, and that hurts households through their role as consumers. And if you think about the firms in the US economy that seem to have, lots of market share and also lots of employees, and so this is, what they're doing to the labor market. Firms like Amazon and Walmart, they really don't seem to leverage their market power against consumers in a serious way. Like, you don't think Amazon and Walmart, wow, the prices are so high. You do think they're really tough on their own workers, and they really leverage a lot of their market power backwards through their own suppliers, and then it hits the workers in the supplier industries. And so that's in our paper, we cite some research on what people have started to call sort of the dominant buyer hypothesis, this sort of squeezing of supply chains. And, it's a non-trivial effect, and it's probably growing more quite recently. But I think it's very telling to me that in the United States, people seem to have greater ability to protect their economic position as consumers than they do have, than they can as workers, which I think is really telling about US political economy. Like in the labor market, you are just completely on your own in terms of policy protections. And it's really odd to me that the couple big monopoly firms we do see operating in the US economy, they really seem to go after workers, not consumers. And that's not really what textbooks, the standard story tells us.
So can I chime in? Okay, so I think that's right for the big public. I think there is for the big public-facing firms. I think there has been a remarkable amount of consolidation on like the things you never hear about. So like brewing companies, for example, and in finance, and so they just wind up driving costs up throughout the economy. And in particular, I mean, patents and just like if you think of Apple and Google, like, the markup on an iPhone is something like 100%. And if you had generics in pharmaceuticals or in tech around, at least a weekend IPR regime, you can really imagine putting a dent in a big chunk of the increase in the labor share. So the paper sort of argues like a big chunk of the labor share decline is like purely accounted for by intellectual property stuff. And those are social decisions to give monopoly rights to those innovations. And, you can argue about the trade-offs between, we need to give them in order to get innovation, whatever, but like that's real, that we are agreeing to give monopoly power to innovations and preventing them from diffusing to other competitors. And so you do see this pattern of like, these superstar firms are in fact really low cost firms that are then marking up low costs really high and making a lot of money that way. And they don't need to expand their labor force very much because they're working in much more like, let's call them intangibles. And I think that's real. And it's a social, maybe my theme here is just that we should think about power generally. It's a policy decision to have a patent system that is as strong as the one we have.
Well, let me expand on that, Suresh, on your theme. I think the new antitrust movement is very cognizant and articulates that it's not so much about the role of firms against consumers, but it's a political economy argument that these large firms with power, they affect policy, they affect politics, and that it's inconsistent with a vibrant democracy and the policies we need to allow behemoths to prevail. And so that in and of itself is worthy of antitrust, and not just if they have the power to raise prices or they do raise prices and hurt consumers. So I agree. We take that broader view. We don't want to speak against this antitrust movement. We just want to identify that we don't think it's really going to have a major effect on the wage productivity gap, but it is a really important political economy issue. And I think that's similar to what Anna and Summers were saying in your paper too.
Yeah, I agree. We broadly agree with that take. And we were actually looking at the rise in product market concentration in different industries, the share of an industry's market that's taken up by a handful of firms, and trying to see if that has much explanatory power for the changes in the labor share in those industries and the rises in corporate profitability. And we found that the decline in worker power just had much more explanatory power for the rising inequality and the changes in profitability at the level of those individual industries and the rising concentration. So sort of echoing Larry and Josh there, I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to add as well, one of the really interesting things I think is thinking about who the power accrues to of the powerful companies. So I think it's at least arguable that the degree of monopoly power in, even conceived broadly as Suresh argued it should be, in the US is no greater than perhaps it was in the 1950s. And certainly if you're measuring aggregate product market concentration, there's a debate about exactly how you should measure it, but there's some argument that it's similar than it was in the 1950s. Think about big auto titans like GM and those kind of companies. But what's interesting is that, the CEO of GM famously said, what's good for GM is good for America, right? At that time. And you might not buy that was exactly true. It's quite convenient for the CEO of GM to say that. But at the same time, GM employed a lot of people. They were mostly employed with relatively well-paid middle-class union jobs with good benefits. Most of the GM shareholders were American. You think about a company like Apple today, not to pick on Apple, but just as an example, it's a company that employs very few US workers. The ones it does employ are mostly high wage sort of tech type workers, not middle class or working class people. Most of the shareholders are a mix of American and foreign shareholders. And so it's much less clear that the companies that hold corporate power in a political sense and that receive monopoly profits in an economic sense are actually creating a pie that ordinary Americans can share in. I think that's an interesting angle that needs to be thought about.
Just one quick thing on, since you mentioned Apple, and it's just something, I forget why, it came up in a research meeting at EPI recently. Even the sort of Silicon Valley monopolies, like to the degree, I'm just always amazed by how little political traction our side generally managed to make out of the Silicon Valley hiring cartel. I mean, that's just astonishing to me that like the richest, most monopolized companies in the world, they couldn't even share with their hyper-educated, hyper-skilled by every standard measure workforce. They had to collude CEO to CEO like baldly to make sure that their programmers, their engineers didn't get cut in on more of the benefits by no poaching agreements and things like that. And so, yeah, I would totally agree with Suresh's broader point. It's true. And I would also just add, just because something didn't contribute to the rise in the productivity pay gap since 1979, of course, does not mean it's fine or it's a desirable feature of the US economy. And so I want to make sure we're not, just talking like there. But yeah, just to the degree to which one of the first way powerful companies look to inject power to their benefit is how can we harm people in the labor market is just sort of shocking to me.
Sorry, wasn't quick enough getting off mute. Okay, moving on. I want to dig into some other research that's been done by a couple of the folks on our panel. So I'm going to go to Suresh first and then to Anna. Suresh, you've done a lot of research about the impact of unions on wages using data from Gallup polls that go back to the 30s. Can you talk a little bit about the research and how does it align with the conversation we've been having today around wage suppression?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things is that, there's a venerable economics literature on unions and the role of unions on wages. But a lot of the modern literature kind of starts in the 1970s with the availability of microdata that finally asked people, like, are you in a union or not? So the census never asks it. And so it starts with the current population survey. And so basically almost everything that labor economists think that they know about unions is from a period where unions are just kind of in secular decline, all the way from the 70s on. And then sort of, we were, and so I had worked on historical unions and was just kind of shocked at how little data there was. There's basically these reports filed by unions with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the unions, particularly in the early period, are just lying. I mean, they have no clue what their members are, and then my co-author Ilyana Kiziemka had been working with this Gallup data for looking at the 1960s. She was like, oh, they have union on them. I was like, really? And then so this paper was born by sort of like understanding that Gallup had been asking union membership at the household level back to the 1930s. And then you could basically take all of these Gallup surveys, put them together and get something that looked like, a million observation data set on historical unions, particularly in this period where unions were increasing super quickly between 35 and 45. And so we kind of did then what, the sort of standard labor economics tools of looking at who is in a union by race and by education, what's the union, non-union pay gap, and over the whole 80-year history of the modern labor movement. And one unfortunate thing is that because Gallup, for various reasons, is only asking about a household, so we can't really do much on gender because our definition of union is at the household level. But one of the sort of surprising, I guess, things is that the union premium is pretty constant. I think it's 10 to 20% over this whole 80 period. And that's also surprising because who's in unions changes a lot over the 20th century. So like if you think of the peak union density period as like the 50s and 60s, that's actually a period where low formally educated workers and non-white workers were much more likely to be in unions than highly educated or white workers. So it's very much like pushes against this idea that like, that unions were always like exclusionary institutions. I think just because of where they were in the labor market, the big, think UAW unions have just like a lot of non-white members, and that's something that you can kind of see in our data. And then the other thing we sort of, I think this audience will appreciate is also just like the importance of policy in generating that kind of increased union density in the 1930s and 40s. And one of the things we kind of leveraged was the fact that because the Gallup data has like what state you're in, you can actually look at like union density by state over this whole period. And you can and then you can see that it's exactly like after the Wagner Act is passed, you see union density jump in the states that are using the new Wagner Act procedures. So like the NLRB elections, but also recognition strikes, and that the Wagner Act really protects recognition strikes in a way that had not been protected before. And so there was lots of strikes in the early 1930s and they always lost. But then the strikes in the late 1930s like win at a much higher rate. And that's partly because of, the Wagner Act. And then the other thing, and then this is maybe if Jared is still listening, that like the other really important shifter for union density across states is war procurement during World War II. So the states that get like an increase in war spending and attached to war spending is like a labor peace requirement, but also just a compliance with the NLRA like requirement. So that basically, if you want to get some of this sweet government money, you have to, you basically have to like make labor peace, and that basically means like allowing unions. And so those two shocks, the Wagner Act and World War II, can basically account for like all the increasing union density you see in mid-century, and those are real policy tools that kind of increase union density, and they don't increase it everywhere in the U.S. So no, you don't get a big increase in union density in Texas. It's really in these states that are like either have like a base of union activists that are pushing for these recognition strikes, or are doing a lot of war procurement. And often those are the same states, probably not coincidentally. So that's, there's lots of stuff in that paper. It's like 170 pages long, but that's kind of the punchline.
No, that is great. And I think the importance of these policy levers, I'd love to get to those. So I think I'm going to try to move us pretty quickly through the rest of the questions so that we have at least a few minutes at the end to dig in on policy and what we can do now. Okay, so Anna, the Josh and Larry's paper talks a lot about eroded labor standards and increased wage theft and poor enforcement and all the terrible things. And you recently released some research about how ineffective the fines are for violations of unions and wage and hour laws. Can you talk a little bit about your findings?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's well known that the US labor market protections broadly are pretty scanty relative to a lot of other rich industrialized economies. But I think, this audience, Larry and Josh's paper, know it, but I think it's not well known generally that even the protections that the US labor market does provide are really, really violated on quite a large scale. So some of the best estimates we have suggest that between a quarter and a third of low wage workers at any given point are seeing quite large pay violations as well, minimum wage underpayment, overtime underpayment, all these other kinds of things, that perhaps 20 to 30% of unionization elections, if not more, feature at least one illegal firing of a worker. More still will feature other illegal actions under the NLRA. And so what this means is that, even that baseline we think our law is providing isn't providing it. And also when we're talking about things like raising the federal minimum wage to $15, which would encompass millions of workers, understanding whether that would actually be complied with and how to make it complied with is really important. So the research I did was focused on basically just taking a very simple approach and saying, if you want to deter firms from violating labor and employment laws, what's the cost benefit trade-off that faces them? And you can calculate What's the expected profit the firm can gain from underpaying its workers or from trying to bust a union illegally? And what's the expected cost the firm will face in terms of penalties or other kinds of costs if it's caught? And the general conclusion, I looked at the FLSA, which is federal minimum wage and overtime regulation, and then the NLRA, which regulates union organizing. The general conclusion for those two laws is that for a large share of firms, there's no economic incentive to comply with the law. And I can share two stats that I think are kind of particularly salient on that. So for the federal minimum wage and overtime, we often think about wage theft as underpayment of minimum wage, right? Because the firm is failing to give the worker something they are legally owed. So the crime of theft, of shoplifting, for example, you steal more than $2,500 worth of goods from a shop in every state in the US, that can be a felony punishable by jail time. The Department of Labor has identified more than 65,000 cases of firms underpaying their workers by more than $2,500 over 2005 to 2016. There more still have been identified by state enforcement agencies and by collective action cases in the courts. Of the Department of Labor 65,000 cases, 10 had received criminal convictions. Only about 10% paid any civil monetary penalty. So you basically, most firms that are underpaying their workers simply have to repay the workers what they underpaid them if they're caught. No incentive to comply. For the NLRA, it's even worse because the law actually does not allow the imposition of penalties on firms. So if a firm fires a worker illegally because the worker is supporting or organizing a union, the maximum penalty that can be imposed is that the firm has to offer the worker their job back and has to repay the worker the back wages that they would have paid them, minus anything the worker earned in the interim. So that's going to amount to thousands or at most tens of thousands of dollars for a given worker, when the cost to shareholders of unionization could be in the millions of dollars, depending on how big the firm is. So it's really no surprise that we see so many allegations of illegal firings from Amazon to Chipotle across the economy when this is the legal situation. But there is hope, because in the PRO Act is a substantial increase in penalties for violations of union organizing protections. And even if the PRO Act doesn't pass, these penalties are being debated to be put into reconciliation. So it seems likely that some kind of penalties will be increased. And on the wage and hour side, the Biden administration has made it very clear that they want to increase enforcement on that side too.
Well, in addition to the PRO Act as being one of the solutions to all of this, let's dig in. I'm going to skip over some of the other questions I told the panelists we'd ask them and move on. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you're thinking about the Biden program for addressing wage suppression and inequality. What's your assessment? What do you think will be successful? Where do you think more policies, different policies are needed? And that is a question to all of the panelists.
I'll take a first shot. I think Jared captured it. So if you go over all the factors that we identified as propelling wage suppression, you can see that the Biden administration is actually acting on them. And I must say that it's the first time in my adult life that any administration, Democrat or Republican, has been so focused on the multiplicity of ways that workers need to have their power improved. So item number one, right now the projections for unemployment at the end of 2022 show that it'll be 3.5% to 4%, primarily because of the American Rescue Plan that was passed earlier this year. So there's clearly going to be a rapid move towards full employment. Now, there's uncertainties because of the virus and all that kind of stuff, but there are some people that didn't want them to do that. And so the Biden administration is taking a risk on the side of workers. There may be other risks, like towards inflation, but they've said, no, we're going to take the risks to make sure that workers are okay. Secondly, they're doing everything they can to expand collective bargaining. Jared mentioned the task force. They favor the PRO Act. You have to get legislation through. That's tough, but clearly everything possible rhetorically and administratively is being done. Third, globalization. There's no TTP, there's no more NAFTAs. The international economics agreement that this administration has pursued was making sure corporations pay profits. I think that's the way you leverage your international economic policy. Fourth, obviously, they're improving labor standards, minimum wage every which way they can, contractors, legislation, overtime pay, et cetera. They're doing that. Trying to outlaw, non-competes and forced arbitration agreements everywhere they can. That's item number 5. Item number 6, fishing. Just today or yesterday, the Department of Labor withdrew the Trump rule that restrained how you can label employers joint employers. Joint employers is how you get someone who's contracting to another firm and essentially imposing low wages to be responsible. So they're doing that. So I'll just say, I mean, there's some, the disappointments are this much and the optimism is that much. Thank you.
Do all the other panelists agree?
I should say I'm not known for being a suck up to administrations. So this is I think this really is a special moment, and it reflects political power organizing. It's not just the work of intellectuals. It's the work of the Fight for 15. It's the work of Occupy Wall Street. It's many other things that happened that changed the whole conversation. It's the Bernie campaign. So, there's a lot of things that have happened that have moved the dial. How much happens, we'll see.
I'm always torn on these things about wanting people to understand that economics is changing, but also wanting people to ignore economists. And I think actually one of the strengths of this administration is that they've left a lot of economists screeching from the sidelines. And I'm like, yeah, cool, great. That's and so I think that's an interesting. I mean, they're taking a gamble on that because who knows. But just as something from my particular sociological corner of the world, being that's an interesting. And so that's thumbs up for me. But it's because I'm a self-hating economist.
Can I say that something I rarely say in public is that the EPI's role is to keep the world safe from economists?
I pretty much agree with what Larry said. Honestly, I think it's all extremely positive. The direction policy is moving. The one area I have for hesitation is not about the policy itself, but is that the changes that have led us to this point have been so seismic, and it's going to take a lot, even just to reverse what we've seen in the rise in inequality, to get it to the levels of the 1970s. But it's not like the 1970s is the world we want to end up in if we care about fairness and justice and equity and equality. And so the scale of the challenge ahead is quite intimidating to me. I definitely think the train is on the right direction and is moving fast.
Josh, anything to add? Okay. Oh, go ahead. Really? Okay. All right. Okay. So as the director of a network of state policy groups, I have to ask, in addition to all the, amazing things that are happening at the federal level, what do you think that states should be doing to address wage suppression?
So I
can answer some of that. I mean, I think it's very different depending on whether or not you're in a blue state or a red state. I mean, it's two different continents. But the blue states can actually do way more on wages in terms of just wage setting, with wage boards, with sectoral bargaining, and some of them are doing it. California, Minnesota, New York, I think, are kind of aggressively forming institutions to regulate wages, not just at the bottom of the labor market, but kind of sectorally or differently for different groups of workers. So think home healthcare aides in California and Minnesota. There's the stuff around just cause firing restrictions that has happened in New York. So I think there's a whole long list of policy stuff that can be done at the state level. But I'd actually be curious to hear from the panel. It's what do we do about the red states? And presumably we think those workers also deserve raises. And so what's the policy solution for workers that are in, say, Alabama, or yeah. So I'd love to hear ideas from other people about that.
I think my answer on that is not so much a policy prescription, but more back to your point of like everything is about building power. And if we don't build power in those states, although it's harder and harder with the restrictive voting rights laws and all the things that are being put in place to prevent people from exercising power, that would change the makeup of the policy makers who are driving the South and other red states into the ground. But I think it all comes back to power. Anybody else on that?
I mean, just one quick thing. I would just say the projections Larry talked about, where we hope, knock wood, that unemployment might be at something like 3.5% to 4% by the late 2020. A lot of that depends on the aid to state and local governments that was part of the American Rescue Plan actually being spent. I think the administration has done a very good job trying to construct rules regarding it to ensure it is spent. They have barred tax cuts. That said, the way you bar the tax cuts is you just forfeit the aid if you decide to cut taxes. And am I sure there's no red state who would just do that? I'm not sure. And so I also think, there's a lot of ways to spend that aid that is not very useful, like just giving it away to business. I think it was North Carolina who wanted to give some of the relief aid to NASCAR, was going to be what they did with it. And so if I was, giving advice to states about what they can do to help wage suppression, I would be spend that fiscal relief sort of directly either to vulnerable households or for public investments like education. Make sure you spend it in a way that maximizes labor market tightness over the next couple of years.
Let me add the points being made, which I all agree with. And a real illustration of this was the Amazon unionization campaign in Bessemer, Alabama. And to note that workers there who were making, not a high wage for warehousing, felt that they were doing better than the minimum wage, because the minimum wage was so low in Alabama, because they were still operating with the federal minimum wage as $7.25. And not only that, Birmingham as a city had raised the minimum wage to a much higher level, but the state government legislature prohibited from happening, but that a basically majority Black city was not allowed to raise its wage, to $15. And so those workers were really beset by manifestations of a race-infused, erosion of power of workers to do better. So, there really has to be a really strong federal role. I mean, and I think it has to be modeled after what can be done in states where we can make progress. But don't forget, the majority of Black workers live in those southern states where there's an ideology of cutting the unemployment benefits, no labor standards, et cetera. And so, racial justice, economic justice requires that we actually build power that can be leveraged federally.
Also depends on us not getting more variants. So they should get everyone vaccinated.
Can I just end on one question? And I'm sorry, we had 84 questions come up in the Q&A. Clearly, there was no way that we were going to get through them. A lot of them are very, very good. So my apologies to the participants who submitted questions. We always run out of time for these things. We'll try to go through them, and if there's some ones that we can answer and send out to the people who signed up for this, we'll do that. But I just want to close on a question of equity, and a couple of folks have mentioned that the projections for unemployment, if the states make all the right policy choices, is 3.5% or 4%. But what are the projections for Black and brown unemployment? Have you all seen numbers for women's unemployment as well?
I mean, most of the time they do not. The places I've seen do not do separate projections like that. Unfortunately, I think you apply the historical rules of thumb. that say the Black unemployment rate is going to be about 1.8 times the overall rate, unless you do something really aggressive with policy to close those gaps. My guess is, even if we did something aggressive with policy, it wouldn't bear as much fruit by the end of 2022 that we would hope. I do think, besides just hitting a low unemployment rate in the end of 2022, I mean, I think part of the transformative effect of tight labor markets is you have to keep it low for a long time. That's when people really see cumulative wage gains. And I think if you keep it low for a long time, like 4 or 5 years of sub 4% unemployment, you actually have some chance to even put pressure on the black-white unemployment ratio in that time period. So I think, but it will not be everything. Like, we need to come up with more and better and more effective policies to finally make those gaps go to zero.
Great. All right, well, we are at time. I want to thank all of our panelists, both for being here and spending the last 90 minutes with us, but also for the really important work that you are doing that highlight the issues of inequality and worker power and what we need to be doing moving forward. And thanks to all the participants too. I believe we are making this recording available to folks, and we'll be sending that out to the people who signed up. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks, everybody.